Welcome, David. Thank you so much for coming and being interviewed today about your workshop that's going to happen at the 32nd Annual New York State Foster Care and Adoption Conference in May. Why don't you do us a favor and tell the community who you are and how you're connected with adoption and foster care?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Shamana. It's my pleasure being here, and thank you for your time and your energy. I identify as both being a relinquishing and adoptee because I've come to understand that these are separate events in my life, and I had to acknowledge them. And ultimately, I was relinquished by my first mother at birth, and I was adopted 7 days after that by a couple who was struggling with some fertility issues, and yet they wanted to start a family. Professionally, I am a clinical substance abuse counselor and a master addiction counselor, as well as an independent addiction and recovery consultant. And in that role, I'm a writer, I'm a speaker, I'm the author of a memoir titled Parallel Universes, The Story of Rebirth, which talks about my experiences, but particularly that intersection between adoption and addiction in my life. Additionally, I'm very active in the adoptee community. I am the addiction and recovery consultant of the National Association of Adoptees and Parents, and I'm a board member of the Wisconsin Adoption and Permanency Support Organization. And that's where I live in southeastern Wisconsin. And ultimately, I work with clients around the world. And I've been doing that virtually since 2013. I truly enjoy spending time with my wife of 37 years and my adult children, as well as friends. And I describe my pursuits as blue mind. I relentlessly pursue that calm mind state that's found by being in and around the water.
What made you or what drove you to want to do this as a profession, if that makes sense?
That's really interesting. I had one of these midlife changes in career paths. Some people call them encore careers. So at 45 years old, I went back to graduate school. I got my master's in addiction counseling. And when I entered that profession, I noticed that many of my clients and patients had been relinquished and fostered or adopted. And as an adoptee, I know that us adoptees represent about 2% of the US population, yet I was seeing adopted individuals at much higher percentages of my caseload, sometimes in the 10 to 20% range. And that made me very curious as to what was going on there because I had never linked my experiences to anything that I had done in any treatment I had received. So it turns out, of course, the research is in. Many studies have shown that adoptees are overly represented in mental health care and addiction care settings. And we have higher degrees of mental health issues, and we're more likely to receive counseling. And we have increased risk of substance use disorders in our lifetimes. And that's typically 2 to 4 times that of the general population. And what most of us in this adoption community understand is that although we often lead similar lives to non-adopted people, we can experience circumstances that need to be addressed, need to be worked through, like that loss and grief and identity development and self-esteem. And ultimately, in the profession I was in, they didn't do a good job of that. Ultimately, they might have asked in a screening question, were you adopted, were you fostered, were you orphaned? But there was no follow-up beyond that. And it was not incorporated in any meaningful way in a treatment plan. So that's what I work to do, and that's what I've dedicated my career to doing. I work with individuals who experience addictions, but also those where relinquishment and or abandonment were experienced as a trauma maybe, and where adoption was experienced as perhaps some type of stress or some type of developmental interruption. And ultimately, to answer your question, finally, sorry, is that's why I've chosen to talk about this. And the title of my presentation is The Intersection of Adoption and Addiction.
Yeah, give us a little synopsis. Don't why would someone want to come and see what you're about to present?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Well, ultimately, if someone is involved or interested in the adoption community, it's really important for us to understand that relationship between relinquishment and adoption and addiction, because the research continues to support the fact that ultimately, in a broad sense, the more problematic a person's development, right, the more problematic a person's growing up was, the higher their risk for later health problems, including addiction. And that started being substantiated in the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study back in 1999 by Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control, and other studies that have happened since then. And ultimately what that means is that relinquishment and adoption, including any attachment difficulties, can predispose one to addiction. And ultimately, to answer the question, we as an adoption community need to be aware of this And we need to discuss ways to proactively resolve these challenges that people have when they experience both an adoption or a foster situation, some type of relinquishment, and other unhealthy behaviors that might have started as coping mechanisms but have turned into larger problems.
When I discuss and interview people for workshops and presentations, I love asking, when you were going on your journey, whatever journey you were taking as a professional or thinking about being an adoptee, were there any mentors, books, helpful things as you went through? Some people love to choose books. Some people have mentors that they look up to that kind of help them out. Was there some in your path?
Sure. Yes, there are. As a matter of fact, what really got me started on my journey was reading a book called The Girls Who Went Away, that hidden story of women who surrendered children for adoption in the decades before Roe versus Wade by Ann Fessler. And it talked about what happened in that time period between the 1940s and the 1970s and what societal expectations were and what were available to single women who found themselves pregnant. And ultimately, that opened up my eyes to what my first mother's experience might have looked like. And it helped me to take a step back and look at what my experience really was, as opposed to what I might have suspected it was without having understood what was actually going on. Likewise, there's a book called Finding Our Place, 100 Memorable Adoptees, Fostered Persons, and Orphanage Alumni that really helped me to relate to others who have had this experience. There's stories of any number of people, some somewhat famous, some really famous, and it shared their experiences with me. It allowed me to have my feelings and experiences validated, and it opened up the door for me doing that exploration and starting that journey. Since then, I've read tens, maybe hundreds of books about adoption, including the classics, The Primal Wound by Nancy Verrier, and Being Adopted, A Lifelong Search for Self by Brodzinski et al., and 20 Things Adopted Kids Wish Their Adopted Parents Knew by Sherry Eldridge. And I've recommended those books to some of my clients as well. The ones I keep going back to and reading are short. I have a short list, but I go to them often. One of them is Coming Home to Self. The Adopted Child Goes Up by Nancy Verrier, because she's telling my story. It's all about identity development and how to gain context around one's life when one doesn't necessarily have access to the facts of their life, and it's really important. It can be really dry, but it's written to the entire adoption community in the triad, so it's very helpful for any number of people involved in that. And the other one is Healing Developmental Trauma, how early trauma affects self-regulation, self-image, and the capacity for relationship. And ultimately, what we've come to know is that early trauma, whether it's a big T or small t trauma, can affect one throughout a lifetime. And this book really offers some solutions as to how that. And of course, mentors, in addition to those books, come in many forms. I've read lots of memoirs, and the adoption community has become really robust in recent years with blogs and podcasts and support groups and organizations like yours and Facebook groups linking us together for that support, validation, and sharing solutions to challenges. And if you ask me, what is the one resource that's been most meaningful to me and that I've referred to most others to, is a LifeWorks lecture given by a gentleman by the name of Paul Sutherland. He's a therapist. It's titled Adoption Addiction, Remembered Not Recalled, and it's available on YouTube. And it talks about that intersection between adoption and addiction, and has been very helpful to me and many others.
You said you wrote a memoir.
I did.
What was yours based on, and what made you want to do something like that?
You know, I had done a lot of work about my experience, and that included a lot of research, reading not only technical books, research books, but also research papers. And I learned that starting way back in the day, in the 70s, this attachment issue started being investigated. And there was a professor at UC Berkeley by the name of Mary Main, Dr. Mary Main, who ultimately said, individuals who can tell a cohesive narrative about themselves are much better, they're much more well-adjusted. And that was a term that was more prevalent back in the day. So they are more resilient. They deal better with life challenges if they can tell a narrative about themselves. And of course, for many people in the adoption community, that's difficult to do because they don't have the facts. So I set out to not only achieve those facts, but chronicle that coherent narrative. Because what I also learned from Dr. Main and others is that those who can tell this narrative pass that down as a legacy to their children. Their children are then much more better adjusted, much better able to handle life and to be resilient and to have positive impact. And I have two adult children who weren't adult at the time, and that became my mission is, okay, yes, I had these developmental interruptions. Yes, I have these places that I might not understand. I don't have the facts, but that doesn't mean I can't hand down everything that I know in a cohesive way. And that cohesive narrative not only involves a chronology, it involves emotional issues and processing that one goes through during those times. And ultimately, I just set out to write something that I was going to leave to my kids, and it morphed into a memoir because as I wrote it and talked to people about it, I was learning from all people in the adoption community that it was meaningful to them, and it actually put into words some things that they couldn't describe. And although
It was almost like a therapeutic thing as well at the same time
it
for you.
was, I'm reluctant to call it therapy per se, but it was very therapeutic.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It helped me to get that all out in a very organized way. Organizing the thoughts for people in this constellation is sometimes very difficult because there's so many of them and they're so powerfully emotionally. I was able to do that, and it's helped me immensely, and it helped others. And I thought I was writing this to myself and to adoptees and my children, but ultimately, many first mothers and fathers and adoptive parents have come to me and said, "My gosh, you've explained things to us we could never have understood otherwise." So it's been very beneficial.
Do you find that there is something as an adoptee, has a lot of adoptees that are advocates, and they find that there's one thing that they usually kind of um, focus on, like some adult adoptees like to want to focus on the original birth certificates and fight for that, or trauma, or the fact that no one listens to an adoptee. They always seem to focus on adoptive parents or first families or birth families. Is there something that you feel that's important as an adult adoptee that you want the community to know that's very important to you?
Wow, that's a great question. And I really thank you for asking that. And ultimately, I am involved in some of those things. I am advocating for open birth certificates here in my home state and have been very active in that for some time. We're drafting a bill currently that hopefully will get to the legislature very soon. And we think that we have a better chance today than we ever have. So that is excellent. And I think that's very important because when we talk about people in this community, identity is such an important issue, not just for the adoptee themselves, but for everyone in the constellation. So that's very important. But ultimately, the answer to the question is I'm just one person, and there are many organizations doing really great things. And when we come together, we can do great things. But I don't know that I'm going to solve many of the problems related to relinquishment and adoption in my lifetime. But what I can do is I can help people once they've experienced that. So yes, I can support. Yes, I can advocate. Yes, I can hope for change, and I can initiate activities that encourage change. But ultimately, I want to better understand individuals who have been a part of that process better than anybody else. And that's my mission, right? Because that's what I bring to the table. I can't go back and change my past. I can't change the way society acted back in the day. I can't change perceptions of others, although I work on mine constantly. What I can change are people's ability to understand their stories and to use that story in a positive way to build resilience and to build that satisfaction in their lives and their relationships.
Excellent. So the last question is, if you had to tell everybody why they need to come and see you, what's the draw? What are you going to,
Well,
what's your thing?
the draw to this community is very obvious. If you're coming to this conference, adoption is a huge issue, right? Almost a third of people in this country alone are affected in some way through their families through adoption. So this is important to you. Secondarily, although we know that trauma is somehow linked in the conversation with relinquishment and adoption, we're not always sure how that plays out. And we're reluctant as a group to sometimes talk about that. And this is a really safe place to talk about the possibility of that having happened and the possibility of that having affected someone in a negative way. Third, as our society becomes more stressed and we deal with more and more difficult things, including COVID and division, political and ideological division, and all the things going on, we see that people are turning more and more frequently to unhealthy coping mechanisms. And of course, in those unhealthy coping mechanisms are drugs of abuse and addiction, as well as addictive behaviors and unhealthy isolation and things. And these are things that I think are really important for us to talk about, not just as a society, but as an adoption community, because they tend to affect us more than they do others, given the feelings that people have and the resources that we have to draw on. So please come and have a lively conversation with us about this. It will be interactive. Bring your experiences, your thoughts, and your concerns, and let's have a great discussion.